Hello, everyone. This is lecture 2 for Intro to Psychology, and I am Marianne Shablousky, and hopefully this will be a very interesting lecture for you. So let me share my screen. Today's topic is psychobiology. And let's get this set up so you can see me and my computer. So we're going to be talking about the brain and the rest of the body and how it functions. And no, this isn't anatomy and physiology, but these are key components that you would need to know concerning your body and how it relates to psychology. So first, let's start with the basic building block here, of the nervous system. That basic unit is called a neuron, and the neuron is what sends and receives signals to and from the brain. It processes those signals, and it does it very, very quickly. There are lots of numbers coming up in the next couple slides. I don't want you to get hung up on the numbers. I mean, they're important, but you don't have to memorize the numbers. But in order for our nervous system to work, there are over 100 billion neurons. That's a lot of neurons, right? There are 3 main types: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons, we get information from our different sense organs. So that would be visual, auditory for hearing, gustatory for taste, olfactory for smell, and tactile for touch. So information is received from those sense organs and then is transmitted via the motor neurons to the brain. And that's when the brain works on that information and then will send information to different parts of the body to tell the body how to react to that information. Those connections between sensory and motor are the interneurons. They help that process move very quickly. When you have a unit like this that works together, is called a brain circuit. So that's a set of neurons that will affect one another. This is a neuron. And assuming you're using the standard textbook, you may have this image already. If you're using a different version of the textbook, always remember to use the graphics that are in the PowerPoint, because then this way I know everyone has the same graphic. So here's a neuron. Up here, the thing that look like tree branches are called the dendrites. That's where information goes into the neuron. We have the soma, okay, that's kind of the brains pretty much of the neuron. This long, windy part of the neuron is known as the axon, and that's where the impulse will travel to get through to the end of the neuron. It's covered with a material, a substance called myelin, and it's what helps speed that process up. At the end of the neuron, we have these things that kind of look like ET's fingers, and these are the terminal buttons. And this is where chemicals called neurotransmitters are located in these little vesicles. And when that neuron is activated, the chemicals in the terminal buttons will transfer information to the next neuron. No 2 neurons touch. There's a small space between each one of them called the synapse, also known as the synaptic gap or synaptic cleft. It's just a matter of semantics. It's all the same. But information then is transferred from the terminal buttons of one neuron to the dendrites of the next neuron through receptor sites that the neurotransmitters will activate either by speeding something up or slowing something down. So I want you to think of maybe a time you've been at a football game or a basketball game where you had to do the wave. Well, remember the wave, woo. So imagine you're waiting for your turn. Okay. You're like a neuron, waiting, resting potential, waiting to be activated. And then once it's your turn, you're activated, you do your part. And again, just like in the wave, just like it is for neurons, it's all or nothing. There's no, you know what I mean? It continues on. So we have these positively charged ions outside, they're going to flow in. We call that action potential when it's time for that impulse to go through firing. So it's, like I said, all or nothing. So that information is going to go along that axon, helped by the myelin sheath. That myelin helps it travel much more efficiently. And we know people who have multiple sclerosis, MS, have a deterioration of the myelin. So the different neurons have a hard time transmitting that information to different parts of the body. So there's tons of research that's being done on that right now. There's no cure for MS, and it doesn't only affect, older individuals. I had a student who was 22 who was diagnosed with MS, very active, was a basketball player, and all of a sudden she started feeling clumsy and was tripping, and she was always an athlete, so this was very unusual. And she was diagnosed with MS, and she really uh, took it hard because she couldn't participate in many activities that she used to participate. And she did try a whole bunch of different therapies that were out. Being stung by bees was one. I know it sounds crazy, but yeah, something like 50 bee stings a week. Being injected with urine from a pregnant woman. She even went out of the country to try some things that were not approved by the FDA. Luckily, she did get into a stem cell research study, and she didn't get back the mobility that she had lost, but it did stop. So the last time I heard from her was a few years ago, and she was making a lot of adaptations, but she was functioning fairly well. But she's still on the stem cell treatments, and so hopefully, as things progress in the medical technology, she will also continue to grow and develop, and maybe they will come to be able to cure MS. MS would be a good paper topic for your research paper. Now, if we were doing this in a classroom, I would be doing an activity right now where I would ask you to get 16 people to hold hands, and we would time how long an impulse would take to go from the person hearing me say go to squeezing the next person's hand, to that person squeezing the next person's hand, etc. And we would take an educated guess at how long that we would think that would be. And I usually get responses anywhere from a minute all the way down to, say, 5 seconds. But because of us doing this, online, of course, we're not going to do that activity. But I want you to think about what has to happen. First, the first person has to hear me say go. Their brain has to, hear that. It has to transmit it then to their other hand so they can squeeze the person's hand. The next person's hand has to feel that squeeze. The information has to go to the brain. The brain works on the information. Again, using the neurons, sends it back to the person's next hand, etc., all the way down the line through 16 people. And when the last person feels that squeeze, they say, stop, and I stop timing. So just in your mind, take an educated guess at how long you think that might be, okay? So typically for 16 people, it's about 3 seconds. And you may think, oh my gosh, all that had to happen in 3 seconds. That's because we have 100 billion neurons with hundreds of connections. That's how amazing our body is. So the brain is the most complex object in the universe, 100 billion neurons, each with 10,000 connections, 10 trillion neuroconnections. That's why we can do that in 3 seconds. So again, don't get hung up on the numbers. A lot of people do. It's just realize there's so many. So here's the terminal button that we were talking about a few moments ago. And as you can see, there are these little vesicles, and in here we have neurotransmitters. Some very common ones you may have heard of, like serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA. So these are stored here. And when that action potential comes along the axon and is stimulating the terminal button, the neurotransmitters are released. And as you can see, here's the synapse, and here's the dendrite of the next neuron. Those chemicals are going to attach themselves to the next neuron through a receptor site. And there are specific receptor sites, like there's a receptor site for serotonin, there's a receptor site for dopamine, etc. And they work just like a key, that it fits perfectly in there. And that neurotransmitter is either going to cause the next neuron to fire, to not fire, to slow down, to speed up, etc., based on what particular neurotransmitter it is. Once it's done here, then that's taken back up, we call that reuptake, into the vesicles, waiting for the next action potential to come along. So these neurotransmitters can be excitatory or inhibitory. Again, excitatory to cause the next neuron to fire, or inhibitory to reduce it or completely stop it. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are probably the most common. If you've ever watched TV and you know that there are pharmaceutical commercials on television, these are the ones you typically hear about. Prozac has been around a long time, in the 80s. Zoloft, Paxil. These are reuptake inhibitors. In other words, it makes the serotonin stay in the receptor site longer in order to get the next neuron to fire. Okay. Now, the interesting thing with SSRIs, you just can't give them to anyone. SSRIs are used a lot of times with people who have depression. It's a mood elevator. But medications work differently on different people. So it's not something that can just be prescribed and he'll come back in a year. First, they take a while to work in your body, anywhere between 3 months to 6 months. They typically start with the lowest dose and work their way up. And they work differently. SSRIs work differently in adolescents and young adults. So here's a person who's depressed. They're given this SSRI to help elevate their mood, and sometimes it causes some side effects. And one of the side effects it can cause is actually suicidal tendencies. So you can't just prescribe this and say, I'll see you in a year. This is something that's prescribed, and then you come back to your doctor within so many weeks or so many months. You're constantly checking in to make sure everything is okay. Um, they are very, very effective. Like I said, Prozac's been around probably for about 40 years, and it's very, very effective, but that's why it's typically not given to adolescents. Young adults maybe a little bit more, but you're still watching that because your frontal lobe is still developing until you're 25. So you're still in that category of brain development. Okay. So when we talk about uh, I didn't want to go forward, sorry. The nervous system, we're going to talk about the central nervous system. That's your brain and your spinal cord. That's the main way how your brain communicates with the rest of your body. Of course, if you would somehow injure or sever your spinal column, you know, say waist high, you would lose feeling below the waist. And if you lose it from like the neck down, it would be from the neck down. So you would be a quadriplegic. So you do have to take care of yourself and your spinal column, and especially if you participate in activities that can cause physical problems. So you do have to be careful to watch your body and protect your body the best you can. We're going to talk specifically today about the peripheral nervous system, and in that, the autonomic nervous system. This is all the things, all the functions that go on in your body that just happen automatically. You know, your heart's beating, your breathing, etc. You're not thinking every second of the day, beat, 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 breathe, beat, beat, breathe out, beat. You wouldn't be able to do anything else, right? So there are so many things in our body that happen automatically. One of them is what we call the fight or flight response. So when we talk about the fight or flight response, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. And anytime your brain senses danger in any way, it automatically goes into fight or flight, which is the beginning of what we would call the stress response. It's automatic. Your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, your respiration goes up. Cortisol, which is the stress hormone, is released. Your body becomes ready to handle anything, that you're going to deal with whatever the situation is, fight, or you're going to get out of the situation, flight. Okay. So that's the sympathetic nervous system. That's what kicks in when your brain experiences any type of reaction to something in the environment. Okay. So all these things are now elevated. How do they come down? Well, that's the parasympathetic nervous system. That's what brings that down. It takes a little longer. So fight or flight is started like that quick, but it takes a lot longer. Some people maybe even up to an hour to lower those responses. So as we were saying, the sympathetic is that emergency preparedness, fight or flight, and increases arousal. And once you're there, eventually your body needs to bring those down. If you don't, you're going to have some issues later down the line. And when we do the section on stress towards the end of the course, we'll talk about this again. What are the effects of cortisol and being in a stress mode for a long time on the body? It can actually lower your immune system, which means you're more readily available to be affected by, a disease or, and I don't necessarily mean something disease like cancer, but it can be anything. There's some research saying that after final exams for college students, many college students get sick, like within 2 weeks. And it's thought that because you were under so much stress, once your body relaxes, then, the cortisol, the stress hormone, it actually lowers your immune system. You become more susceptible to, getting a cold or something else, stomach flu or something that may be going around. So the interesting research. Think about the last time you took final exams, if that happened to you. Here's the brain. Yeah, it kind of looks like a big cauliflower, I know. We have two hemispheres, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. It's connected by what's called the corpus callosum. It's a bundle of thick fibrous materials, and it's how the left and the right hemisphere do most of the communicating between the two hemispheres. And we're going to talk about the different parts of the brain. You don't have to know every single section of the brain for intro to psychology. If you were taking anatomy and physiology, yes, you would need to know everything. But for psychology, there are certain parts you do have to know. I have them labeled here, and no, they're not really that color. I mentioned that because I actually had a student one time ask me if they were actually that color. So no, they're not that color. It's for just entertainment purposes only, so they stand out. So we're going to be talking individually about the occipital lobe, which is back here, back at part of your brain. The temporal lobe, that's on the side by your temporal. Parietal is kind of the crown part of your head. And then, of course, frontal, that's a dead giveaway one, right? Your frontal lobe in the front. And I had mentioned earlier in this lecture, this is the part that doesn't finish developing until you're 25. You may have always wondered how they picked that number for car insurance to go down. That's it. Because at 25, you're thinking with an adult brain that's finished developing. In most cases, at least that's what the research has. There's actually there was one study that said in men it could go to 27, continuing to develop. But that study was never really replicated yet, so we're going to stick with 25. So if I asked you, when does the frontal lobe stop developing, we're going to say 25. Okay. So let's start with the occipital lobe, again in the back. That's what works on all our visual processing. And if you've ever had a concussion, ever, even not completely blacked out because of a head injury, if you see a flash of light or stars, like flashing lights, then this is the part of the brain that has been injured as part of the concussion. It's the only part that would give you that experience of the flashing light. The temporal lobe, language comprehension. So if you're understanding what I'm saying right now, thank your temporal lobe. If you're hearing what I'm saying right now, thank your temporal lobe. Any new information, so if anything I'm saying right now is new information, again, you got it, thank your temporal lobe. And it's where we store all these visual memories. So this is where your brain is going to store this image with the nice 4 colored parts of the brain labeled. The parietal lobe, again, on the top toward the rear, kind of the crown part of your head. And this helps us to keep attention and pay attention. So if you're able to pay attention to this lecture, again, that's your parietal lobe. It's also very good for spatial locations. Are you right side up, upside down, north, south, east, west? It's not like a compass, but getting your bearings in a location. And the frontal lobe, and I'm going to kind of move this out of the way for right now. So the frontal lobe is all our executive functioning, all our planning, our memory search, all our motor processing takes place there. All of our reasoning skills, like I said, executive functioning. Up here we have a kind of a drawing of a skull that was maimed, no other way to say it. The guy's name was Phineas Gage, and he worked for the railroads. And in the old days, they used a blasting powder to try to dig the holes for these rails as they were building the railroad. And one time he didn't put sand in. It was just an oversight. He was a great worker, great family man. People loved him, never late, just super guy. Well, he forgot to put the sand in, and this rod went right up through his frontal lobe. Amazing that he even survived this. But they found that he had some memory issues afterwards. They were able to remove it. That alone, right, is amazing. But his personality changed. He was late. He swore more. He never really did that before. His family and friends said it was like living with a different person. He just wasn't the same as he was before. Now, there is some research on Phineas. After a period of time, it did get a little bit better. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely permanent. But originally, yeah, there was some major changes. And that's why we say this area is kind of the home of our personality and who we are. So if you do activities or sports where you can have head injuries, you do want to protect your brain. That's really, really important. We don't think about it. I taught one of my high school students years ago was sled riding, and he hit a patch of ice, and he literally went head first into a tree, and he ended up with amnesia. He couldn't remember anything that had happened to him in the last 3 years. And it took a while. He got some of that back, but it really was disturbing because friends that he had met in high school, some of them he didn't know. He spent almost a whole year trying to get back to where he was. And he was a football player, and he was basically told he wasn't going to be playing sports anymore because if he re-injured to the severity as the first time of his brain, there was a good possibility there could be some major loss of memory that he wouldn't gain back. So he, as much as he loved playing sports, not anymore. Okay, so this is known as the strips, and don't panic, you don't have to memorize all this, but I do like this slide because it gives you an overview of what parts of the brain. Remember, we have the corpus callosum connecting the two. So if we cut the corpus callosum and we laid the brain flat and was looking at it, you can see they're basically labeled. And of course, there are more functions, but I just wanted to show you these. Here's over here, the tongue. And notice on the other side, the other lobe, there's an area for the tongue. And we got lips over here and lips over here. And we got eyes and eyes over here. Fingers, elbow, neck. Look, genitals, just here, just like a few other things. So if that part of the brain would be injured, there is no backup, if you know what I mean. Your brain is very plastic, and what we mean that it's fluid. It can be moved, it can change, it can find its way around pathways that are not open anymore. But if some of these places are injured that are only in one part of the brain, then you may have some dysfunction in that particular area. There's a thing we call split brain research, and it's a great paper topic. Now, I won't test you on it because I'm hoping somebody will pick it as a paper topic. If nobody does before the end of the course, I will explain the split brain research. It's actually in your textbook. There's a nice one section on it. It's an interesting read. But in the early days of people who had epilepsy, so it wasn't, the epileptic center wasn't transmitted to the other hemisphere. They didn't have some of the technology, of course, that we have now. They would cut the corpus callosum so the person wouldn't have that episodic interference in the other hemisphere. And cutting the corpus callosum caused some interesting, I hate to say side effects because they weren't really a side effect. It was actually a physical change in how the brain would work. So no, this is coming up, but if people still need a paper topic, this is an awesome paper topic. And this is what I like to call my cheat sheet. If you want to know the basics of the brain, the key parts that you should be aware of. Oops, sorry. Here's just a summary. So the thalamus, of course, is that crossroads where information is transferred. The hypothalamus is what controls our body temperature. The hippocampus is our memory, helps to store information. The amygdala, we talk a lot about in psychology because the amygdala is kind of our entrance into the limbic system, the old mammalian brain, but it's where our emotions and our feelings are at. So you can see the tie-in with psychology there. So when we do more information on feelings and thoughts and how we process that, we will come back to the amygdala, especially in the next couple lectures. So, but that's one you definitely need to know on that list. Basal ganglia is how we form habits. Our brainstem is what gets us to wake up in the morning. People who may have problems with like narcolepsy may have issues with part of their brainstem. And there are medications that can be used to help regulate that. People who have narcolepsy can fall asleep very easily, but they have a hard time getting up. So they actually take medication that will help them to wake up. You and I just think, oh, we get up. But there's some people that they would sleep and sleep and sleep and sleep. So maybe you know someone who has that, but it can be very disabling. And then standing up and walking tall instead of walking on all fours, that would be our cerebellum. And again, so we know what the human body is. As young adults, you should know where your organs are. So I'm not going to give you a picture of a human body and ask you to fill in all the places. If you take anatomy and physiology, oh yeah, you're going to be doing that and a lot more. But for psychology, you should know basically your human anatomy. So that's what this slide is for. So you do know where your pancreas is, and you do know where your kidney is, and you do know where your heart is, etc. So this is more for reference. So there are different hormones, it's part of that endocrine system, and there's different hormones that are released throughout our body. In particular, we're going to talk about these three: testosterone, estrogen, and cortisol. Cortisol, we mentioned cortisol already as the stress hormone. Testosterone and estrogen, both men and women have testosterone. Men tend to have more testosterone and less estrogen. Women tend to have more estrogen and less testosterone. We didn't understand this in the early ages. So if you ever heard, the old stories of the circus in the early days, they would have a bearded lady. Well, the bearded lady probably had a problem with her endocrine system. She probably had 2 times or 3 times as much testosterone as she had estrogen. and therefore she would have had facial hair. So it makes perfect sense now, but in those days, they were thought to be freaks because of this. We didn't understand how these hormones worked in our body. Okay. Testosterone is what gives you your basically your sex drive. Estrogen, of course, women need estrogen. If you would have to have a complete hysterectomy, especially if you were young, your OBGYN may decide that you should be on a hormone replacement. That's an interesting category in itself, because there are some hormone replacements that have been found, that addition of estrogen can actually possibly cause cancer. There are over-the-counter, natural supplements people can take. But typically, if it's early on, if you would have to have a hysterectomy, they will try hormone replacement. There's a really good older drug, believe it or not, it really is an older drug. It came out like in the 50s, Estratest. It's half estrogen, half testosterone. And there seems to be less issues with development of any type of cancer because you're adding equal amounts of estrogen and testosterone to the body. So how do we learn about the brain? Well, we have technology, as I said now, an EEG. Maybe some of you have had an electroencephalogram. It's done by an electroencephalograph. And they conduct these electrodes to your brain. If you've ever had to get a sleep study done, you would see this occur. They monitor your brain waves. They have a camera on you while you sleep, and or you can do them at home. Now they have kits that you can attach yourself, and you don't have to go into a facility to have it done. CAT scan, if you've had any injuries to your head, you may have had to have a CAT scan. MRIs, there are MRIs that are done on different parts of the body. More people may have had an MRI than a CAT scan because it can be used for so many other possible injuries. But a lot of people don't like MRIs because it's kind of a closed area. They do have open MRIs, but the magnet is not as strong, so the image isn't always as good. So depending on what the injury may be, they may recommend don't do the open MRI to do the closed one. And it is very claustrophobic. There's just a couple inches from the top of the device to your face and just maybe an inch on either side of you. So it can be, and it can be very loud. So normally they give you these headphones to put on, and they ask you what type of music you like, and they put music on to try to calm you and relax you because of the loud banging noises that you will hear. But you actually get to see wonderful pictures of inside the body. PET scans, seeing your active living brain functioning, and it's color coded. And we have analyzed so much of the brain now that by looking at these PET scans, we can tell areas that are too active, areas that are not active enough. We have actually even mapped, looking at these brain scans, if somebody's an alcoholic, a schizophrenic, etc. So the technology is remarkable now compared to what it was. So if there is brain damage, no matter how you injured your brain, there are lesioning techniques. If you have a tumor, they can use a laser to cut out the tumor. They can use a laser to stimulate the brain. If you know anyone who's ever had a stroke, you can always tell the side of the brain that was affected because it's always opposite. right brain controls the left side of the body, the left brain controls the right side of the body. So if the right arm is affected, you know, the stroke was on the left side. Stroke would be another good paper topic for your research paper. And you don't have to be old to have a stroke. I've had a student who was 15 who actually died from a stroke. So it's not something, oh, it's not going to happen to me. It's just for old people. No, no, it can happen to anyone. There was a news reporter probably about 15 years ago. Thank heavens for someone watching the news. It was a live report, and she was kind of slurring her words, and it was like a word salad. That's what they call, like, the syntax wasn't correct. So she was like, if you were saying, I'm going to go to the store, it would be like, store I go. So it didn't make sense. And people thought that she was intoxicated, you know, live on air. And a nurse actually called into the television station and said, hey, your reporter is having a stroke live on TV. And they did get her assistance, because if you can get to a person quickly, you can reverse the effects of the stroke. And like I said, we can stimulate the brain using different techniques, and it's done all the time now. Now, I'm going to give you the quickest genetics course known to humankind. You all know what DNA is, deoxyribonucleic acid. I'm not going to ever ask you to spell it because everyone calls it DNA. When I went to school, the only people, and I'm old, when I went to school, the only people that understood what DNA was were scientists or people taking biology class. DNA is talked about on Dora the Explorer. I mean, young people even know what DNA is. We have mapped the entire human genome and tell you exactly what part of that DNA structure is going to, you know, affect what part of that human's body. So we start with genes. This is what we get from our parents. You know, get half from mom, half from dad. Okay, total of 46. So 23 from mom, 23 from dad. That's your genotype. That's what you receive from them. The phenotype are the physical characteristics that we see. Blonde hair, blonde hair, assuming you're not dyeing your hair with Clairol. But I mean, whatever your natural hair is, you know, do you have ears that come out? Do you have ears that are closer to your head, your nose, any characteristic, the color of your skin, the length of your fingers? That's phenotype. Okay, that's what we see. And what I'm going to talk about genetically is going to be a lot more complicated than I'm going to make it right here, because we could have just a course on this. But this is your little 5-minute condensed version of genetics. So it's not as simple as one as the other. So if you have mom and dad and both of them have brown hair, and the child has blonde hair, it doesn't mean that the child is the male man's child, you know, and not the spouse. It's more complex than just two things getting together, because that genetic code is from centuries and centuries. You never know when that gene is going to show up in your gene pool. So that if anybody's ever done a DNA test on their dog to see all the mixes, you will get this list of your dog has genetic code from this, and you thought they were just a golden retriever, and they're not. So a little genetics. So let me do this. You should be able to see me. Okay. So I know it may be backwards on the board behind me. But let's see if we can get this to work. So if mom has dominant traits and dad has dominant traits, we always write the dominant trait with a capital letter. In this case, I'm going to use brown hair because brown hair is a dominant trait. So if you have the dominant trait for brown hair, you're going to have brown hair. Again, the simplified version. So that's typically written. They have both dominant traits. That means that they got a dominant trait from mom, a dominant trait from dad. Let's say they get together with a spouse that has a dominant and a recessive trait. So that's the recessive trait. It's as a lowercase letter. If they decide to reproduce, their possible children, called a Punnett square, would be brown hair, still brown hair. As long as the dominant trait is there, they are going to show the dominant trait. Brown hair and brown hair. So all the possibilities are brown hair for that child. But let's say we have a couple that get together and they each have a dominant and a recessive trait. So what are our possible combinations? Well, we would have brown hair, still brown hair, brown hair. Even if the first letter in the pair is recessive, remember, if the dominant trait is there, it's going to be there. But look, two recessives. Blonde hair, red hair, white hair, no hair. So I'm going to do an activity that you have to kind of look in the mirror yourself to do, but I'm going to prove to you that you have a dominant or a recessive trait. You probably don't have too many instructors asking you to stick your tongue out at them. And normally I would go around the room and see if you were able to do this, but since it's filmed, you have to do it yourself. I want you to try to roll your tongue. That means make your tongue like a U. So take a second to do that. If you're able to roll your tongue rolling is a dominant trait. If you are unable to roll your tongue, you know, it just won't go anywhere. It won't make that U shape. Then you have two recessive traits. You physically are not able to roll your tongue. Somebody could say, here's $1 million if you can roll your tongue. And you'd be like, because you can't do it. You do not have the genetic code to do that. And there are a whole bunch of them listed in your book. So, you know, how your ear shape, how your nose, etc., what your fingers look like. You know, some people can't do the Vulcan, you know, sign, if you remember from Star Trek, you know, live long and prosper. Some people can't do that. They physically don't have the genetic code to do that. So check the mirror and you can see if you have the dominant trait for tongue rolling, or do you have two recessives? You can go around to all your family and friends. They're going to go, what? You did what in psychology class? But you learned something about your own genetic code without having genetic testing. Okay? Questions? Let me stop the share for a second. Okay. So let me go back to little corner. If it will let me. Okay, so we just have a couple more to do. So let's talk about pruning and plasticity. I already mentioned how the brain is very plastic in the extent that it's able to work around issues. If the brain needed, for some reason, to get to a different part of the brain or different part of the body, it can get around issues that are going on with the brain in many cases. But your brain does prune away things that it doesn't use in order, to find the quickest processing speed. The brain finds the quickest route to go. This is one of the reasons why we say early stimulation of the brain is very, very important for children. So you see programs like Reading is Fundamental and the Sarah Hines House, and where you want to stimulate the brain as it continues to develop, because again, it's going to continue to develop till 25. So if you don't use it, you lose it, that old line. It's also the same reason why we say people who are older should continue to do things that are actively engaging their brain. Even some things like doing crossword puzzles or word searches, reading part of a newspaper and making sure you understand it. We had a woman at our local church who used to play 46 bingo cards at the same time and never used a marker, ever. I was lucky I could do 3 without a marker. She did 46. She was in her 80s. She could keep all those numbers and what was marked on all those cards in her brain. Talk about an active brain, at her age. So it's important that we keep our brain active. And that is it. Get out of here. And there we go. So I just wanted to say thank you for watching class. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Feel free to email me at my email address or see me in class. And I hope you have a great day.